Okay, ready to dive into some seriously interesting stuff today.
Definitely. Always up for a good deep dive.
Let's talk about fear. Like, really talk about why we're afraid of the things we are.
You mean like why some people are scared of spiders, but not, say, driving in rush hour traffic?
Exactly. We've got this TED-Ed video on risk perception, plus some fascinating insights from psychologist David Myers.
Should be interesting to see what they have to say.
All right, so to kick things off, picture this. You're heading to the airport, maybe a little stressed about the flight, right?
Yeah, I think most people can relate to that.
But get this, statistically, you're way more likely to die on the drive there than in the actual plane.
Really? How much more likely are we talking?
170 times.
Yeah.
It's a pretty eye-opening stat from Myers' research. He looked at data from 2009 to 2011, and mile for mile, cars are just way more dangerous than planes.
Wow, that is surprising. Makes you think about what we actually choose to worry about.
For sure. It turns out we humans are kind of terrible at judging risk logically.
I guess we're more influenced by emotions than we realize.
Totally. And one of the big culprits here is something called the availability heuristic.
The availability what now?
It's this mental shortcut our brains use. Basically, we judge how likely something is to happen based on how easily we can recall similar events.
Oh, I think I get it. Like if you just saw a news story about a plane crash, you're more likely to be nervous about flying, even though it's statistically very safe.
Bingo. Our brains latch onto those vivid images or stories, and they become our go-to examples, even if they're not really representative of the bigger picture.
Makes sense. I guess our brains are wired to pay attention to the dramatic stuff, the stuff that, could really impact us.
Yeah, that's how we survived as a species, right? Paying attention to threats. But in today's world, those threats aren't always what they seem.
So true. We might be more scared of a shark attack than, say, a heart attack, even though heart disease is a much bigger risk for most people.
And it's not just sharks. Like, think about all the anxiety around flying. The drive to the airport might statistically be the riskiest part of the whole trip, but people still freak out about turbulence.
I'll admit, I've been there. Those bumpy rides can be nerve-wracking.
It's all about those images that pop into our heads. Plane plummeting from the sky. Terrifying, even if it's incredibly unlikely. Driving on a highway? Seems pretty normal even though it's statistically more dangerous.
And the media doesn't really help, does it? They're always highlighting the sensational stuff.
Totally. Big, scary headlines grab our attention. But they can also skew our perception of what's truly risky.
So are we basically saying our emotions hijack our ability to think rationally about risk?
That's a big part of it, yeah. And it gets even more interesting when you think about events like terrorism.
How so?
Myers brought up this point after 9/11. More people actually died in car accidents because they were so afraid of flying they chose to drive instead.
Oh, wow. Trying to avoid one risk, but actually putting themselves in more danger.
It's a really tragic example of how our distorted risk perception can have serious, real-world consequences.
Makes you think about how fear can be used to manipulate people. Like, in that case, the terrorists achieved a secondary goal. They made people afraid to fly, which disrupted everyday life even further.
Exactly. And it highlights how important it is to be aware of these biases.
Yeah.
Because even if we intellectually know something is statistically safe, those emotional memories and vivid images can really take over.
And it's not just big events, right? Our own personal experiences, even just one isolated incident, can totally change how we see risk.
You're right. Myers told this story about an airport worker who refuses to fly. They see all kinds of travel disruptions every day and are convinced flying is just too risky.
But wait, they work at an airport?
Yep. It just goes to show how our limited personal experiences, even if they don't reflect the overall picture, can shape our fears in powerful ways.
So what we see up close and personal can have a bigger impact than, any statistic or fact.
It's like our brains say, well, I saw it happen once, so it could definitely happen again.
Makes you wonder how much of what we're afraid of is actually based on, well, solid evidence.
Right. It's a question worth asking ourselves, for sure. It's almost like we're wired to focus on the negative, even when, the odds are in our favor. But is there anything we can actually do about this? Like, can we rewire our brains to be less afraid of the wrong things?
I think so, yeah. Just knowing about this availability heuristic is a good start. It's like, once you see the trick, it's harder to be fooled by it.
Right, like knowing how the magician does the illusion kind of ruins the magic.
Exactly. So the next step is to start challenging those knee-jerk fear reactions. Like when you feel that surge of anxiety, take a breath and ask yourself, is this fear based on like real evidence, or am I just letting my imagination run wild?
So kind of like a fact check for our feelings.
Exactly. And then, once you've identified that maybe there's some bias going on, you can start digging deeper. Look for data, look for evidence that might contradict those initial assumptions.
So it's about being more mindful, more deliberate about how we react to things.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, not freaking out over every news headline. This applies to so many areas of life. Think about health decisions, for example.
Oh man, don't even get me started on those health headlines. It's like every day there's something new to worry about.
It's a perfect example of the availability heuristic in action. You see a headline like, eating this doubles your risk of cancer, and suddenly you're convinced you're doomed.
Oh yeah, for sure. Doubles your risk. It sounds so scary.
But the thing is, those headlines often focus on relative risk, which can sound a lot more dramatic than it actually is. What we really need to consider is absolute risk.
Wait, so what's the difference?
Okay, so let's say your baseline risk of getting, I don't know, some rare disease is like 1 in a million.
Okay, 1 in a million. Got it.
If something doubles your risk, it sounds terrifying, right? But in reality, your absolute risk has only increased to 2 in a million, which is still, incredibly small.
So it's all about how the information is presented. They make it sound like the sky's falling, even when the actual change in risk is tiny.
Yeah, the headlines are designed to grab our attention, make us worry, even if the actual threat is, statistically insignificant.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap?
Well, like we were saying before, it's about being a critical thinker. Question those headlines, do your research, talk to experts you trust. And remember, risk perception is always subjective. What feels risky to one person might seem perfectly fine to someone else.
Like some people love skydiving, and others get nervous just thinking about it.
Exactly. So part of it is just understanding your own risk tolerance. Some people are naturally more cautious, while others, are more comfortable taking chances.
So it's not about eliminating risk altogether. It's about being more aware of how we perceive it and making choices that align with our own comfort levels.
Exactly. And, speaking of external influences, we also need to be aware of how marketing and advertising can play on our fears.
Oh yeah, like those home security system commercials that show like scary footage of break-ins.
Totally. They're tapping into that availability heuristic, making those images of crime readily available in your mind, even if the actual risk in your neighborhood is low.
It's like fear-mongering disguised as helpful advice. You need this product to protect yourself from this terrifying thing that probably won't even happen.
It's a really common tactic, and it's not just products either. Think about political campaigns.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean. They focus on hot-button issues that get people riled up, even if those issues aren't necessarily the most pressing problems facing society.
It's about understanding that our emotions can be manipulated and that, sometimes what we're being told to fear doesn't actually match up with the real risks.
So how do we become more discerning about the information we're bombarded with?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, critical thinking, questioning assumptions, seeking out different perspectives.
Not just blindly accepting what we're told, but actually evaluating the evidence for ourselves.
Right. And that's true whether we're talking about health risks, financial decisions, or, even who to vote for.
This is all so interesting. It's like we've been given this new lens to view the world through
Yeah.
and to make, hopefully more informed decisions.
The world of risk perception is definitely complex. But I think understanding these basic concepts, like the availability heuristic, relative versus absolute risk, the influence of external factors, it can really empower us, help us make more rational choices.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, learned about how our brains can, kind of trick us into fearing the wrong things,
Yeah.
focusing on stuff that's vivid and dramatic, but statistically not that likely.
Yeah, we've talked about the availability heuristic, relative versus absolute risk, and how things like marketing and media can really play on our fears.
But now, the big question, how do we actually use this knowledge? How do we get better at, assessing risk in our everyday lives? Not just talking about it, but actually doing it.
Well, I think it all starts with awareness, right? Now that we know these biases exist, we can start to notice them in our own thinking.
So, next time I feel that, that surge of anxiety, I should hit the pause button and be like, hold on, is this real? Or is my brain just messing with me?
Exactly. Don't just blindly accept those feelings. Give your rational mind a chance to, catch up. And then once you've identified that maybe there's some bias creeping in, you can start digging deeper. Look for evidence. Look for data.
So, if I'm worried about some health risk, I shouldn't just freak out based on some scary headline.
Right. Go beyond the headlines. Consult reputable sources. Talk to an expert you trust.
It's almost like becoming a detective for your own fears.
I like that. Instead of blindly accepting them, you investigate, you gather evidence,
Hmm.
and then, you make a more informed judgment.
So knowledge really is power in this case. The more we understand about how our minds work, the better we can manage those fears and, hopefully make better decisions.
I think so, yeah. It's not about eliminating fear altogether. Fear can be a good thing. It can protect us. But we need to be able to tell the difference between rational fear that keeps us safe and irrational fear that, holds us back, prevents us from living the life we want.
I'm definitely feeling a lot more empowered after this deep dive. Like I have some new tools to work with,
Me too. It's been great.
and I hope our listeners are feeling it too. We've explored some, pretty complex stuff, but ultimately comes down to this. Become aware of your biases. Think critically, and don't let fear make your decisions for you.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of risk perception.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and as always, don't be afraid to question everything.